Hey guys, this is Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video. We're continuing our look at the Clone Wars today by examining the Navy of the Republic and specifically its Star Destroyers. Now I'm going to be upfront. Some of you who have binge watched all of my videos or who are really into the lore on your own may know some of this information, but for others you may be surprised to learn that the Venator and to a lesser degree the Acclamator were not the only Star Destroyer or Star Destroyer-like vessels used by the Republic. And because I did mention the Acclamator there, it's probably good right off the bat to get a definition out. What is a Star Destroyer? Does something like an Architect's command ship or hell, even an Acclamator count as a Star Destroyer for this video? Nah. A Star Destroyer is going to be a very large, let's just say 1 kilometer or longer vessel which has the traditional components of a Star Destroyer. A forward-facing wedge, you guys will know it when you see it. We'll start off with the Venator. Of course, everyone knows the Venator exists, but you may not recognize that there were several Venator sub-variants, or at least alterations made during the war. Fantasy Flight Games in Star Wars canon has actually distinguished between a Venator 1 class and a Venator 2, though that's probably partially just to sell material. That being said, there are prominent differences. The most interesting one, I think, is how some Venators have a flight deck which can partially open to let out small vessels without exposing the entirety of the ship. Fantasy Flight Games also uses an image of what looks like an Imperial Venator for a Venator 2, so that could indicate that the second class or the subvariant came out towards the end of the war. Moving on though, let's talk about other ships which made their way into the newly formed Empire. One, which would arguably be the most famous of their entire navy. As our friends over at the Essential Guide to Warfare explained, the Venator was joined by other ships in the Star Destroyer class. Whalix Blissix left KDY for Rendili Star Drive and created the Victory class Star Destroyer. The project which created the Victory was known as the Victor Initiative Project and was ordered directly by Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. The really interesting thing about the Victory was how well it worked with the Venator. Obviously, the Venator had heavy weapons, but it really was a carrier and dedicated a lot of space which could otherwise have been used for weapon systems or power generation to carrying starfighters. The Victory was a similar size to the Venator, but was much more heavily armed and armored, meaning it was more appropriate for a direct ship-to-ship fight. So when the two ships are operating in tandem, one can work as a support ship, carrying starfighters, even facilitating ground operations if necessary, while the Victory is really there for the heavy-hitting moments, and to be honest, stacked up super well against most of the CIS fleet, except for their most large vessels. I will note too that one thing Star Wars Legends played up was that a Victory was small enough so that it could actually enter atmosphere and operate near a planet's surface. Obviously, canon has allowed the ISD to do that, and to be honest, I think that makes sense anyway, so that's less of a distinction worth noting. Either way, I just think the Victory makes a lot of sense for the Republic, especially where the Venator does have certain shortcomings. Later on in the war, again turning to the Essential Guide to Warfare, Venators would be supplanted by two new classes of KDY Star Destroyers, the Hangarless Tector and the Imperator. I do note that they talk about how the Venator was supplanted by these two new ships, indicating that although the Victories did see some service, they still weren't as common as the Venator, not by a long shot. So we've talked about the Tector in a prior video before. It's got a somewhat interesting history. Basically, during the Battle of Endor, the Millennium Falcon flies over what appears to be sort of the upper surface of a Star Destroyer, but in actuality is at the bottom of a Star Destroyer. You can tell by the little markings, it was a model turned upside down. However, the ship is missing the hangar and the reactor bulb. This led eventually to a new class of ship being designed, the Tector. The idea was that it was a Star Destroyer, but even more heavily armored and without the large fighter bay. The Tector was much less common than the Imperator, which would of course be later named the Imperial class Star Destroyer, which itself was a significant upgrade in terms of firepower than something like the Venator. Not even close, really. We've talked about this before on the channel, but the Order 66 Republic Commando novel actually deals with the new ships being introduced to the Clone Wars and how Palpatine has secretly been manipulating Republic shipbuilding spending. There's actually a quote from the beginning of Chapter 5, which I think I want to eventually do a whole video around, but I'll read it out here. So, we're building more ships for the Republic, far more ships than they have crews to run. In fact, and how much more armor? Have I missed a decimal point here or something? I mean, this is an even bigger order than Camino casino place 12 years ago. Doesn't that sound weird to anyone? And how many criffing years are we going to have to store at this time? That was a production line supervisor at Rothana Heavy Engineering. Chapter 14 of that same novel has clones looking at new warships, realizing that they don't recognize them, and that Palpatine had reinforcements coming in and secret ships being built the whole time. Still, these ships didn't see very much use, and they were really being created for the Empire. Aside from that, the Republic Navy did have a few very large ships, which are probably worth mentioning. First of all, there was the Mandator. You've probably seen this fan image going around. It's not an official render of the ship, it's just a fan design. Very interesting story here. Basically, the Republic, through the Ruusan reformations, limited shipbuilding and specifically made it so that very large capital ships, including the dreadnought-sized Mandator, couldn't have a hyperdrive. Existing Mandators at the time of the Clone Wars were sitting protectively and also as showpieces at planets like Kuat. When the Clone Wars broke out, not only were they weaponized, but some were refitted and perhaps more were built as the new Mandator 2s. Again, we haven't seen images of the Mandator, but we know that they were Star Destroyer shaped. The Praetor class battlecruiser was another vessel created by KDY and used in a limited way during the Clone Wars, and it's very likely they also used the Procurator. Presumably the Praetor Mark 1 looks pretty similar to the Praetor Mark 2. There's also a Maelstrom class battlecruiser. We know very little about this ship. It's only appeared in source books. I attempted to make what I thought the ship would sort of look like on an extremely basic level, and that's here. But again, we know very little about the Maelstrom. And aside from things like the Victory 2, which may have served during the Clone Wars, and the Acclamator 2, again, not really a Star Destroyer, that pretty much rounds out the hidden ships of the Republic you probably, or at least maybe, didn't realize existed. But guys, I'm going to keep it at that. Until next time, please let me know what you'd like to see. Let me know how you thought of this video and anything else. Like if you liked, dislike if you disliked it. May the Force be with you.